late October. My mother was still setting the table for her as she was convinced she might walk in at any moment. "It's my fault for yelling," she said. "If anything happens to her, it's my fault. Since she was just a kid, my sister had excelled at school. A promising future awaited her. Everyone said so. As for me, well, people told me to be nice to her as if I was destined to depend on her. When she broke the news that she wanted to be a journalist, my parents didn't take her seriously at first. You might as well become a haymonger if you're so desperate for a dead career. Don't expect us to support you if you don't take your education seriously. They were just trying to keep her on the right path, I'm sure, so that she wouldn't waste her talents. But what they didn't know was that this was the only path Allison had ever wanted to walk. Watching her talk about it, I was convinced that she could bring the fire back to journalism with her determination alone. Nothing could be truly dead with Allison around. They got into a big fight and Allison left. Like my parents, I assumed she'd be back once she cooled down. But she was gone. When the police informed us they had found her phone and wallet in a ditch, they told us to prepare for the worst. "Runaways often ditch their phone, but never their wallets," said an officer. From his voice it was clear he wasn't expecting her to be found alive. It was after that conversation that I went for a walk, to the protest of my parents, late at night in the rain. I felt sorry for them. All they had left now was a screw-up. And if they couldn't have even that, what then? Allison had left no clues on her social media and none of her friends knew her whereabouts. She had just vanished without a trace. Yet, I felt that she was still out there, somewhere. What sort of situation could Allison possibly fail to prepare for? She'd practiced self-defense for years and knew the details of hundreds of crime stories by heart. I imagined her to be working on this story right now, about her perfect escape. Just as I pictured myself reading her book detailing it all, I noticed something. On the porch of an old house was an expertly carved jack-o'-lantern looking incredibly lifelike. With the light flickering inside, it seemed almost like a soul, eager to escape to the great beyond. There were others, an old man with a bushy beard, a woman with wrinkles and a cigarette in the corner of her mouth, and a girl. From a distance I couldn't quite make it out. The light inside was much brighter than in the others that the glow made the contours gently fade out. However, my gut told me I had to have a closer look. As I climbed the fence I felt my pulse rising considerably. This was like something Allison would do. Not me. I'd always been the sort of person to retreat to the kitchen at parties so I wouldn't have to deal with too many people at once. Now I was trespassing, and for what? Some pumpkins? The lights were off inside the house. Presumably, the owners were out. There was no car in the driveway either. Still, once I was over the fence I crawled across the lawn. You can never be too careful. I stopped for a bit when I imagined the owner slamming the door open, shotgun in hand, to find a stranger crawling across their property. They might take a shot at me out of plain fear. While the thought petrified me at first, I kept crawling when I gazed up at the porch and saw my suspicions confirmed. The girl carved into one of them looked exactly like Allison. There was no mistaking it. The face of my lost sister had been carved into this pumpkin. The expression on her face was one of anger. Now close enough to touch it, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. As I stared into her face, I had the feeling that she was there, staring back at me. Whoever carved this, I realized, knew exactly what Allison looked like. It was too perfect to have been made with a picture as reference. Also, she hadn't been angry in any of the pictures we had given to the press, hopeful that someone would recognize her. Judging from the state of the pumpkin, it hadn't been long either. The others were in various stages of decomposition, soft and bulging, a sweet scent of rot emanating from them. So entranced was I that I never noticed the door opening up. A man with a salt and peppered 5 o'clock shadow and a weathered fleece jacket looked at the stranger on his porch and smiled. "You like that one, don't you?" Frozen in shock, I wasn't able to get a single word out. He continued, "Took me a while to carve that one. It's special to me, you know. It's my daughter. She passed away last spring." "Allison had a twin?" "No, even then I know. This looks exactly like my sister," I said. The expression on his face changed, barely. I couldn't work out what he was thinking. "There's a man living a couple miles from here that's my splitting image." Friends often complain that I've walked straight past them on the street and they just look confused when I tell them that's not me. That's Peter the accountant. Seeing doppelgangers for the first time can be unnerving. Come in for a cup of tea and I'll show you some pictures of her. I thought about what Allison would do. Pictures? Well, if I saw pictures of someone who looked exactly like her then I might believe it. It could just be a massive coincidence. But if he was lying, I looked back at the pumpkin. Allison, or this man's dead daughter, looked less angry than scared right now. It could just be the light. All right, I said and picked up the pumpkin. For comparison, I added. The man laughed and said, all right then. Inside the smell was nearly unbearable. Apparently the jack-o'-lanterns outside were just the fresh ones. Inside were a whole collection of rotten ones, some looking more like puddles than anything else. Please excuse the mess, he said. After Jessica disappeared, my wife couldn't take it and she left. I'm not much of a housekeeper, you see, and I don't get many visitors. If I knew you were coming, I'd have cleaned up the place. He brushed off some old newspapers from the couch and invited me to sit. Let me just find the album, he said, and left the room. I stared in the pumpkin in my hands, looking exactly like my overachieving sister. This time, however, she didn't seem to look into my eyes. Instead, she appeared to be gazing across my shoulders. I turned around to see a set of family photos hanging on the wall. One of the persons in the pictures was definitely the owner of the house, but it must have been taken a long time ago. In all of them, he looked at least 20 years younger. Standing beside him were not a wife and a daughter, but two people I presume to be his parents. An old man, looking a bit like the owner, but with a great, bushy beard. And an old woman, with wrinkles and a stern expression on her face. They seemed somehow familiar as well, like I'd seen them somewhere before. Suddenly I felt as if my spine had spontaneously turned into ice. These two, they were the faces on the other lanterns. It then occurred to me that might not be all that strange. If he'd carved the face of his daughter, why not his parents as well? It did fit the theme. Yet, why did he choose to make their expressions so terrified? It didn't make sense. That's not how you pay tribute to lost loved ones. That's an act of revenge. I decided I had to get out of there, and I was taking the lantern with me. Just as I was about to leave, the owner returned. Hang on, he said. I have the pictures right here. Sorry for taking so long. I'm not all that organized, you see. That's all right, I said. I just got a text from my parents that I have to go home. I'm sorry. Perhaps I'll be back later. You're not taking my daughter with you, are you? His tone of voice made it seem as if he were telling a joke, the punchline known only to himself. He stepped closer as I tried to open the door. It was locked, and worse, I couldn't see a door latch. This door wasn't meant to keep people from coming in. It was meant to keep them from escaping. The owner withdrew a carving knife from his pocket and let out a high-pitched laugh. I hope you aren't as much trouble as your sister. She really didn't want to stay here and keep me company. And she kept asking me all these questions. Turns out she had already figured out what I was doing, and yet she came here alone. She had noticed pets disappearing and managed to trace it back to me. She was working on a story, an expose. Unfortunately for her, she didn't even know half of it. Where is she? I said, tears streaming down my face. He laughed, again. She's been right under your nose this whole time. I looked down at the pumpkin, at Allison's face, and I saw that her expression had changed once more. She looked frightened and stared deep into my eyes, as if pleading for me escape. Then I noticed the decaying pumpkin spread across the room. Dogs and cats of various kinds. He had started with pets, then moved on to people. And my sister, my brilliant sister, had worked it all out. For a moment I cursed her courage. Why did she have to come here all by herself? Why couldn't she at least ask me to accompany her? If she did, then she might still be. Don't worry, said the man as he approached me. I'll put you two side by side. He raised his carving knife, and as I braced myself for what would come next, the pumpkin in my hands exploded, its backside bursting onto the man. With a shrill scream, he dropped the knife and wiped burning hot wax off his face. I was left holding only the face. Allison's face. This time, she appeared to be smiling. As fast as I could, I crouched down and grabbed the knife. I stuck it deep in his throat. He staggered back in shock and pulled it out. Blood gushed from the wound and he tried to stop it, but it was too late. Then, something strange happened. His skin seemed to turn a shade of orange. Little by little he transformed until all that was left was a deformed, pumpkin-like mess on the floor with a crude imprint of his shocked face on the surface. Even his blood had disappeared. Only a brass key remained next to what was left of him. I picked it up and sure enough, it fit into the lock. I still hold on to the knife and what's left of my sister. My parents believe I carved it myself. I've never had the courage to tell them. I'm not like my sister. People were right, though, that I'd depend on her. Even after all that, she was the one to save me. I've decided to become a journalist. Even if I'll never be half as good as Allison, her fire lives on inside me. I chose to post this story here because you never know if there are others out there. Even if you don't believe me, please keep my story in mind if you see a jack-o'-lantern out there that looks just a bit too realistic.
There's always a reason to be afraid.